Welcome to another webinar in the series covering the VetCert standard. This session covers Units 10 and Units 12. Unit 11 is a standalone session. Unit 10 is about planning in urban development situations and infrastructure, and Unit 12 is personal skills. So, veteran trees, planning for urban development and infrastructure. You need to demonstrate an understanding of how veteran trees should be considered during the planning and construction process in the country of examination. And of course, that does vary really quite hugely. And that's what we discovered when we undertook the VetCert project, how different the guidelines and standards are within each of the countries in relation just to urban planning. So you need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the legal framework guiding the construction of urban development and infrastructure, and actually how these relate to veteran trees. And the fact you need to be able to understand that industry guidance may not be adequate actually for veteran trees. Planning legislation and guidance in the country. So examples in the UK would be the Town and Country Planning Act, for example, which has provision for preservation and planting of trees. There is other industry guidance in the UK, such as the British Standard. In Sweden, for example, there is now a standard for tree care. There's also a standard for trees in relation to construction, or rather guidance rather than a standard. So these things vary, and you need to demonstrate an understanding of actually what that means in relation to veteran trees in particular. So design and layout, protection, mitigation, any kinds of enhancement measures that may be necessary. You also need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of good practice for protecting veteran trees, which, as I've said, may be different and more than your industry standards. So in particular, things like root protection areas. We'll look at this picture in a bit more detail in a minute, and buffer zones with regards to any type of construction. And sometimes it's not about construction. Sometimes it's in relation to events, for example, about where the parking is and how access is, and if there are veteran trees in the way. We would expect you to be able to understand how to avoid damage to veteran trees in those situations and circumstances. And that you will understand, for example, these kind of tree protection areas, that in this particular case, this tree was actually protected by having a fence. And this is a picture we showed, a small one there, the fact to give this kind of illustration of how industry guidance may not actually be enough for veteran trees. So the British Standard has 12 times the stem diameter when it's 1.5 metres, it's 12 metres, it's capped at 12 metres. According to the Ancient Tree Form, for example, it should be 15 times the stem diameter. So this tree they're using has a diameter of 1.5 metres. And then the third one actually shows roots were still actually being recorded at 23 metres. So I think this is very interesting to understand that industry guidance may not always be adequate for veteran trees, and that's what we would expect you as a VetCert consultant to understand. You need to be able to undertake an assessment of the impact of proposals on veteran trees and their successors too, not just the veteran trees, but the new veteran trees of the future, allowing reasoned decisions to be made in the planning process. And I think in a way this is what we see in veteran tree management, that it's some of the indirect impacts which become more important, obviously directly if a tree has to be felled, but sometimes the pressures that occur, even with the best of intentions, a decent root protection area has been retained and management has been put in place to conserve that tree, it may be that people suddenly picnic under it, in which case the issue for risk management becomes much higher. So we would expect you to have that in your mind. So construction activities is a very common one, that it may be you've done a fantastic job at placing the houses far away from the tree, but then when the contractor comes to dump all the gravel, it's dumped under the tree, or they put the toilet facilities under the tree. But again, it's the indirect issues as well that we would expect you to be able to have an understanding of, and that you take that into account when considering veteran trees. You would be expected to be able to prepare a management plan to enable the protection of a veteran tree before, during and after a construction process and temporary events. We've already mentioned that it's not just about construction. It may be about a big festival or that whereby we want to ensure the protection of the roots. And again, this is applied knowledge. So we would expect that a consultant would be able to produce a management plan for these purposes of development, which includes the protection areas, assessment of the impacts, and any other types of mitigation that would need to be put in place. We would also expect effective site supervision. And just this point that I made earlier, that with the best of intentions, things can go wrong. So ensuring that you've got the protection and the mitigation and the enhancement measures actually are delivered and are effective throughout the process. So the resources that are available for you here, we've mentioned this already, but there's the Veteran Trees in Urban Areas is a film which is specifically looking at some of these points, the extra and additional pressures that are on our veteran trees in urban environments. That's something that's worth definitely a look at. So the other unit we're going to cover in this session is the one personal skills. And you might wonder, well, what's that really got to do with veteran tree management? But actually demonstrating excellent communication skills which help promote the protection of veteran trees, and negotiation and motivation skills are actually sometimes more important than actual management. And there are many examples of that we discussed through the process of the development of the VetCert standard, that actually being able to convey a message of the importance of veteran trees is extremely important. So therefore, it's included in the VetCert standard. So that you should be able to influence, motivate and collaborate. Those are kind of the three examples of where we will expect you to be able to work with professionals within the industry and with other disciplines. So there's often no legal requirement to undertake management. So being able to influence and motivate landowners, for example, to promote the conservation of veteran trees is something that can be really valuable and really important. And if we can't communicate, then conservation is an awful lot more difficult. It's indirectly tested in several parts of the assessment rather than directly tested. So it's just something that you're aware of. And that we would expect you to be able to promote two-way communication so that you're able to listen and that you're able to communicate clearly and without too much complication to both practitioners, to other people who are non-specialists, to a landowner, to a site manager, consultant. You may want to talk to a contractor. That communication is two-way, so you need to listen as well. And that's often where many of us are less good at our communication skills. And no one person knows everything. So you must be able to listen to others and take on new information. And in particular, I think that's important if there's someone who owns a tree, they may actually be very, very passionate about that tree. And encouraging that and giving them more motivation is very, very important. And being open about your knowledge and open about your lack of knowledge. And we all have areas where we have gaps. And then, of course, it's very important that you can produce high quality written material in the form of clearly written, accurate and concise reports. There are none of us that want to read huge, long, detailed reports. Actually, being concise is really very important. You will be expected to produce a veteran tree management plan as part of the exam, and that we would expect that this is a way in which trees can be protected for the future. And if people don't understand what's been written, the management may be wrong that's implemented, and the management may be misunderstood. So very often as a consultant, you write a report which then is given to a contractor to implement. And you may not have the opportunity to talk to one another So it's the only means of communication. And the difference, I guess, in these reports from standard arboriculture is that do nothing might actually be an appropriate proposal in a report, which might seem very strange in standard arboriculture, for example. But it may also be appropriate to also offer several options for management and explain the pros and cons, the potential cost-benefit analysis part of that. So this is something in a way that might be different in the reports that you would need to produce in order to show that you have this particular expertise and skill. Negotiation and motivation skills. Well, I think we've all, I'm sure, experienced opportunities when motivating others is half the battle. For example, with regards to the different values and potential conflicts in the land use. So it might not always be about the tree, that it could be that the veteran tree is growing there and there is a road nearby or footpath nearby, or it might be the aesthetic value, which is, and there's also high biodiversity values, and they may actually be in conflict with one another. And the fact that people value trees for different reasons, in particular veteran trees. And some people think they're ugly, others think they're beautiful. And it's really important that you acknowledge those differences and that you're able to acknowledge those differences. And the fact there is often a need to compromise, that a measure of kind of human psychology and group dynamics is actually really important. I often say when we're managing trees, it's as much about psychology as it is about biology. So we would expect you to be able to demonstrate some of those abilities and skills. So organisational skills, you might wonder what's that got to do with anything? Well, again, the long-term management is often built on clear and accurate records regarding what's been done so that we can learn about what to do in the future, and that those records are clear and concise and easy to understand. Sometimes it's enough that it's just a photograph, but the photograph has a name and a date and a location. That many of the trees that we're dealing with in relation to VETSERT are, trees that will be there for centuries, we hope. And that means potentially their management will be there for centuries to ensure that it's properly documented to enable us to learn for the future. And in a way, this is more important than for younger trees because of the fact we're still learning about how the impact of our management results, or the results of the impact of our management in relation to veteran trees. And then finally, in this unit, the recognising the limitations of your professional abilities, because let's face it, none of us knows everything, and that you need to act professionally, and therefore you need to understand and acknowledge the limit of your skills and seek help where necessary. Earlier in these webinars, we've talked about species knowledge, for example, that a person who's very skilled at identifying lichens is unlikely to also be very skilled at identifying beetles. That's just one example. And that we would expect a VETSERT professional to be able to acknowledge particularly the limit of their skills and bring in other professionals. Veteran trees cross boundaries: arboriculture, ecology, heritage, aesthetics, landscape history. So contact colleagues or professionals in other disciplines to help provide advice on specific matters, including input from practitioners, actually, because that exchange of knowledge between the practitioners who are perhaps climbing the trees and see things very differently from when you're standing on the ground. So we would most definitely expect those skills too. So that's everything for those units 10 and 12, and the final webinar will cover unit 11, which is veteran tree management in all its aspects, and that's the largest unit in the VETSERT standard. So look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.